Apple II forever, making life better and better. Apple II forever and ever, bringing the rainbow to you.
This is a real pleasure for me to be able to join everybody there at KansasFest today. And it's always fun to go back a few decades and reflect on the Apple IIc story. It really was quite an adventure. So let me dive into it. So it started in early '81, and Apple was going through an interesting time in its history. They had previously launched the Apple III product, and they had gone public. What they were discovering was that the Apple III wasn't selling very well. I was scheduled for an interview on a Wednesday in February after I had driven across the US from Ohio seeking work in Silicon Valley. And I showed up at the Bandley Drive offices, and there were no cars in the parking lot. Thought that was kind of weird, but the guys I was meeting with, Jerry Manick, who headed industrial design there, was waiting in the lobby, and he said, "Hey, I got to tell you, Rob, today was Apple's first layoff ever, and so everybody was sent home. We tried to reach you." So, so it was an interesting start at Apple, but they were going through a reorg immediately following that, and I was just barely qualified for the job they were looking for. But I followed up over the past month and a half with dozens and dozens of phone calls. And finally, I got a call from the VP of Engineering's administrative assistant, and she informed me that I didn't have to call anymore. So I thought, of course, oh, damn, I didn't get the job. But she said, "No, you got the job, but you have to agree not to call the VP of Engineering for at least 2 months." So that was my start at Apple. So previously, I had gone to San Jose State and done some engineering after I'd gotten my degree in industrial design. And because I was good at making models, I ended up making models for Star Wars at Lucasfilms. They were working on the movie The Empire Strikes Back. And it's interesting, some of the what I learned there came into play when I was later designing computers at Apple. After that job, I had gone to Ohio and helped a fledgling design firm get started. And I was designing everything from solar panels made out of fiberglass for Owens Corning to designing new hypothetical sprinklers for Scott's Lawn Care. They were considering going into the business at the time, which informed some of the work that I did at Apple too. So, of course, when I joined, the Apple II was the cash cow for the company. They had, after the layoffs, they shrunk from 11 divisions to 7 divisions, but the vast majority of the revenue was coming from the Apple II you see in the upper left-hand corner. So they weren't entirely sure what they were going to do next, but they knew they needed some good-looking accessories and peripherals to go along with it. So to the right, you see an early sketch of, a few of these product ideas. But they weren't entirely sure what real project they should give me to work on. So I was kind of wandering around until somebody said, "Hey, these Apple IIs are really expensive to manufacture, and the housings and such needed to be painted, and they required hand sanding, so they were very pricey." So, so the first assignment was to design what became the Apple IIe, E for economical. And not a lot of people knew what the E really stood for internally at Apple. So I was told I had to stick with the same shape and look and feel, and then as well as keeping the 45-degree chamfer angles around the top. So the bulk of the work was really centered on making the back panel and the rest of it very affordably manufacturable, and for the first time in Apple's history, using injection molding processes to make high quality, super durable housings and cases. And then, of course, designing the back panel so that it was a lot friendlier for people who were less tech savvy to add boards, cards, and as you can see, lots of different cables and connections at the time. So that was an interesting project. I learned an awful lot about computers, but I wasn't really able to be super creative. There were some other initiatives. At one point, Apple was considering doing its own line of modems to go along with the Apple II. Here was an early sketch. I didn't totally love having to put chamfers on everything. So in this concept here, you can see that I put the chamfer on the bottom of the housing. Jerry Manick, the lead industrial designer, he gave me a bad time about that. But you can see at the back, it had the little vents and stuff just in the same style as the Apple II and IIe. But I wanted to start playing around with new ideas. And I knew that if I wanted to develop a relationship with Steve Jobs, I was going to need to do some stuff that really kind of started being provocative. And so here was one of the early sketches from August of '81. So I'd been there, maybe 4 months or so when I did this. And sure enough, when he heard that somebody was doing new concepts and kind of pushing the envelope with thinking about what could be done, he always wanted to see what was going on, even though he was primarily focused on the Macintosh project. So, but you can see here, I was envisioning, what could be done with an LCD or flat panel display, and envisioning them being really thin and such. Here was another idea of an Apple II that was not expansive, didn't have slots for third-party cards, that type of thing. It was basically, the idea was how to make it as minimal as possible and friendly and approachable so you could use it in a lot of different situations and places. But you can see in the lower right-hand corner, I was experimenting with how to reduce the mass of the computer. So there'd be a semi-triangular shaped board, wings extending beyond it in one of the iterations. And then in the upper right-hand corner, one of the engineers challenged me to come up with the smallest possible concept. So there wasn't even a bezel around the keyboard, and the storage was going to be with a micro cassette tape. So that led to other experiments. There were people talking about doing compact computers at the time. And there were a few kind of fledgling things showing up in the market or being presented. So this was kind of a take on a direction that we could take the Apple II. Now you can see I wasn't following the design, look, and feel that Apple had established at the time, or the color scheme, which was kind of based on HP products at the time. I was pushing the envelope. I was getting some heat from some executives, but Steve really kind of liked some of the new ideas and introducing new thinking into the mix. That was until Grid Computer introduced their Compass computer. And we were just all blown away by how sleek and cool and kind of dangerous, Darth Vader-like look and feel that it had. Of course, doing something that extreme and making it entirely out of metal wasn't something Apple wanted to do. They didn't want to charge $10,000 for the computers who wanted something less expensive. So this was an early concept of how we could potentially do one with a flip up flat panel on it. But the real issue at the time was, and by the way, this is a page from the board presentation that Steve Jobs gave when he first was trying to convince the board to fully fund the Macintosh product. Now, this was, and he proposed that it would launch in January of 1982. So this was 1981. And you can see at the top, the price of the Apple II system at the time was just under $2,500. And then the Apple III was just under 5,000. And then the projection for the Lisa was 6,000. So Steve's original price he wanted to sell the Macintosh was $4,000, in $1,000 to $1,500 range. It eventually, of course, was introduced at $2,495. The dilemma for the Apple II division at the time was that, holy crap, we're the profit center of the company, and if Steve comes out with the Macintosh, have killed off the Apple II division. And at the same time, Steve was kind of certain about the direction we should be taking. So I showed him one day a security alarm system that I had designed for a company at my previous consulting firm. And of course, the first thing he said was, get rid of all those buttons. So I had to explain to him, well, that's a numeric keypad, Steve. Kind of hard to get rid of all the buttons there. But that spurred some interesting discussion, and he wanted me to, push the envelope, but he recognized that I was the youngest designer at Apple, and I was actually not totally qualified when I'd been hired. So he was open to the idea of hiring or engaging some outside designers to do some hypothetical designs, just to re-energize the internal industrial designers throughout Apple and mechanical engineers. So we settled on giving a project to several design firms. They were all in Europe. And the one that I recommended was a firm called Esslinger Design. And I just loved their TVs they were designing for Wega and some of their hi-fi stereo systems. They were just so simple but brutally utilitarian. It was kind of a form follows function. But he brought another thing to all of the products that he and his colleagues designed, and that was they brought emotion to the notion of form follows function. So Steve liked them, and we visited the world's best designers in Italy, the guys who were designing for Olivetti, and we engaged a really great firm in London also, and we hired them to do a bake-off. And the project was called Snow White, and Jerry Manick, the lead industrial designer, was the one who came up with the name. And we had 7 divisions at the time, so each one represented one of the 7 dwarfs, and that led to this project. And we had $100,000 to split amongst these agencies. And Esslinger Design came back with some really radical designs at the time. And instead of sending drawings, that type of thing, he sculpted mock-ups out of polystyrene foam, and then they painted them with latex plastic. So what you see here on the screen was their initial concept for the follow-up to the Apple II. And you can see that on top, they have the side vents, that type of thing, and then they have a sloping front, but a detached keyboard. So that was good for some good discussion and some arguments. So we engaged them, and then Steve signed them up for what we thought was $1 million contract, but it became a $2 million contract to develop hypothetical designs and real designs for products for each of the divisions. And what you see on the left were some of the initial ideas. And then they even did a version, the follow-up for the Apple IIc, fully injection molded, but designed to accommodate all of the boards, but now employing this new, what we called the Snow White look at the time. But of course, that thing was just unwieldy. So we were still trying to figure out what the Apple II follow-up product would be. And so I put together a sketch one day for, different use cases for it and how we could take a form factor that Steve had described as the Apple II book and how we could make that, friendlier and more usable in lots of different places in somebody's home, where they work, going to school, in the kitchen, and so on. And that led to some of the initial concepts that were based on the design look and feel that was clearly the direction we were going to follow from Esslinger Design's work. And at this point, Esslinger Design had changed the name of the firm to Frog Design, and they'd set up an office in Los Gatos, California, very close to Cupertino. So they were coming up with ideas, and I was coming up with ideas, and would get together periodically, and we would show each other some of our ideas. The funny thing that emerged at the time was that Steve had told them that they were leading the project, and Steve had told me that no, they were just generating ideas, and I was leading the project. So neither of us knew how much we were competing with each other for Steve's favor on the best design. So one of the ideas I had was to put have the disk drive, the floppy drive, come out the back of the computer. And you guys have probably heard that Steve was not one to mince words. He, when he saw this drawing, he said, "Gemmell, what the hell is this? What, you're wasting our time. What the fuck, And so I said, "Come on, Steve. Some of it might be messed up and bad thinking, but not all of it." So he crossed his arms and he kind of huffed and he said, "Okay, show me." So I talked through all the different design details, and he kind of said, "Okay, that's okay, that works, that's okay, that works." But when I got to the reverse disk drive, he said, "There's no way in hell people are going to like that." But I explained some of the rationale around it, how the computer can now fit into a smaller space, and now you don't have to be reaching to the side, that type of thing. And if you want to have a mouse, now we have that space available for that. So he indulged me, and we looked at other iterations, and I probably generated, I don't know, 8 to 10 different iterations on this design before we took it into 3D models. So here was one of the very first 3D models that we built of what became the Apple IIc. Now, at the time, we had codenamed the project Moby, but somebody in the press got a hold of the name. So our CEO at the time, Mike Markula, he got sick of our code names leaking to the press. So he said he wanted an unprintable code name for the product. So he said, "We want to call this new product Elegant Little Fucker." And then, of course, everybody jumped on in the acronym for it. So the code name became ELF for the Apple IIc until it switched to Terry and Philly and some others. So I don't know how many of you had heard that story. So here was one of the early designs for what became the ultimate design. Now, we were getting together with iterations that Frog Design was doing too, and we would meet with the newly hired CEO at the time, John Scully, and of course Steve would be there. And so we would all present our own drawings and models and such, and discuss every minute detail. And Frog Design would go away and they would integrate some of the feedback in their next iteration, and we would too. And we kind of ended up with designs that were so close that the differences were literally just a few millimeters here, a few millimeters there, maybe a tighter radius here and a tighter one there. But I have to tip my hat to the guys at Frog Design. They were the ones who suggested we use a tilted angled font on the keyboard. And because of that, we should duplicate that with the and give a slant to some of the buttons that we used, the power button and some of the others too. So we continued refining, but of course, them being consultants and stuff, they didn't have to worry about designing things and figuring out how the connectors were going to work, and working with the electrical engineers and convincing them to squeeze the board tighter, 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 so we could fit one more connector in across the back. So it led to some very interesting relationships and discussions with those guys. At this time, I introduced in the previous concepts, I didn't comment on it, this notion that we should have a way of tilting the computer up so that particularly people learning to type for the first time, or the hunt and peck people, it was easier for them to type. So we wanted to integrate a handle that reinforced the portability of it, but also turn that into a device to tilt the and increase the keyboard angle up higher. So that became an elemental component and feature of the product. The other was coming up with a new way of designing the latch and the experience people had inserting and removing floppy disks. I don't know how many of you recall, but floppy disk drives at the time were really awkward, clunky, and noisy also. So we worked hard to try to design versions that were quieter, sleeker designed, and they had a nicer feel as you pushed in, grabbed the latch, and pulled it up to remove and eject the disks. And here you can see one of the accessories we had designed too, the remote disk drive. So these are all visual models, of course. And then laying out the back panel design and getting that detailed just right. We would meet with Frog Design and Steve, and we would argue over every little millimeter on these. And one of the things that really disappointed Steve was that we were generating so much heat that we had to add additional vents across the back panel, and we had to double up the spacing of them. But there was just no way around those. We did a ton of thermal testing, and we did it old school. We would just go out to the local head shop and buy incense. And then there was a room in our building that we would rope off, and we would heat up the computer and let it stand still. Nobody could go in and disrupt the air. And then we would sneak in very quietly, light the incense, and would go out and watch what was going on through a glass window where the smoke came out of the vents. And that eventually led to the final layouts of the ventilation in the housing with this transparent lucite case we made. So we ultimately launched in the spring of 1984, and here's a very proud Steve Jobs and John Scully at the Moscone Center. And this is a layout from a magazine called Communication Arts, and they did a big spread on the event for the launch of the Apple IIc, and it was dubbed Apple II Forever. And so you can see here the layouts in the middle. That was the brochure that all of the attendees were given in a little packet. And then you can see, oh, sorry, you can see in the upper left-hand corner a photograph, an overhead view of all of the demo stations and peripherals and third-party vendors that were making hardware or software to go along with the Apple II and the Apple IIc. And then all of the graphics that led up to the opening and the entrance to the Moscone Center. And then when the products were announced and the unveiling was handled, people realized that underneath their seats in this auditorium were little covers with a briefcase that I had designed, and those briefcases held first edition Apple IIcs, and Apple employees were positioned next to sales reps and salespeople, and Apple employees gave those computers to those people so they could see one for themselves and play around with it right there in their seat. So it was a huge hit. And then, of course, this is the initial packaging for the original Apple IIc. You know, we did a big red thing, not to be missed by anybody. And this was a beauty shot of the original IIc with the monitor. And I want to tell you, we broke some kind of records with Sony getting this monitor to market, because a number of months before we launched, we did some focus groups with people in several cities across the US to find out what they thought of the IIc. And of course, they all had to sign non-disclosure agreements and stuff. And a lot of people liked the computer and they realized how cuddly and stuff it was. But when we asked them how many would buy it, it was far less than 50% of the attendees, which was a little humbling, until we showed them what the computer would look like with our projected monitor that was going to follow, you know, was going to hit the marketplace 4 to 6 months after the introduction. Well, then it went up to closer to 60% of the people who would buy it. So we said, holy shit, we need to rush that monitor into production. So it was available to ship when the IIc launched in April. So that was a miracle they pulled off. And then the next product that I designed for it was the LCD display, and there was no way to integrate it, so we designed it so it would rest on top, but there were soft rubber grooves on the stand that gave it a nice place to support it if it was on a desktop or some other place, but those were designed to be thin enough that they fit into the ventilation grooves in the top of the computer. So it would be kind of semi-attached to it. So here you see the different views, and you know, this was back when we did all the design on drafting boards, and so I would turn over my designs to some mechanical engineers and the blueprints and drafting people, and they would then translate it into moldable parts, and we would do test runs of those and do temporary tooling to generate all of the pre-production units that we would use for our reliability testing and so on. But this is what I would supply to the rest of the engineering team to do their part. So of course, you know, after I did my part, they did the really hard stuff. So I did some additional work, and I went to Germany and spent time working with Frog Design in their studio there and working with Hartmut. And a fun story that I'd like to share with you was it was a lot of fun working with Steve. And yeah, periodically he would walk into my cubicle and he would say something like, he wouldn't say, "Hi, Rob," or anything like that. He'd just walk in, look at me, and he'd say, "What is this piece of shit you're working on?" And I would again have to talk him through the thinking, and I would find out, what the lightning rod for him was. I would fix that, and then the rest of the design he would love. And on one occasion, he grabbed a drawing off my board, and he ran back to the executive building and ran around and showed a bunch of other execs, the newest design that was hot off the drafting board, so to speak. So working with him was, the agony and the ecstasy, I guess I could say. So while I was working with Hartmut on what might be the next generation 2C, um, Steve was launching the Macintosh in Europe, and he was tired of the cooking in northern Germany, where he had been in Berlin and Hanover. And he had chartered a jet because he was also sick of the commercial airlines, and he needed some pasta. So he called Hartmut and me. We were in Stuttgart, and he said, "Hey guys, I need to get some really good pasta for dinner tonight. So I've got a jet, and if you'd like to join me, I'll pick you up in the Stuttgart airport in 90 minutes." So we hopped into Hartmut's souped up BMW, and we made it there in time. It was about a little over an hour's drive for us, and then we had to get through, security and stuff. And we met him on the tarmac, and at the side of the jet, and he welcomed us on board. We flew to Milan. We're met by the general manager of Apple Italy, and with a limo, and we all piled into the limo, and we drove about 20 feet, and Steve said, wait, stop. And Steve realized that we were going to go to this really fancy restaurant, and Hartmut and I hadn't had time to change, so we were wearing jeans and t-shirts or polo shirts, I forget exactly what. Steve hopped out of the limousine and took off the three-piece suit he was wearing in the jet and put jeans and the t-shirt on and joined us and we got whisked off to the hotel that had the fantastic restaurant. So the other part of the story is that he wouldn't let them give any of us menus. He knew what we all needed for dinner, and he proceeded to point to different things on the menu to the maitre d', who then placed the order and ordered some great wine. And then we discovered that dinner was 7 courses of pasta. That was it. No salads, no entrees, 7 courses of pasta. But it was fantastic. After dinner, we all went back to the airport. He dropped us off in Stuttgart and then went on to Paris because he had arranged a date with a woman he said looked just like Isabella Rossellini at the time. So that's my Steve Jobs story I wanted to share with you. So as Chris very kindly mentioned, I then transitioned into marketing and assumed responsibility for everything that Apple marketing did that was 3-dimensional. So trade show booths, events, the packaging team, awards that were given to top salespeople, all kinds of crazy 3D stuff. But then Steve left, and I really missed Steve. And Commodore had just acquired Amiga computer. If any of you remember the Amiga computer, it was like a Macintosh on steroids, and it was full color, where Macintosh at the time was still monochrome. So they lured me away to become their head industrial designer. And one of the first products they asked me to work on was a cuddly version of their Commodore Amiga. But of course, they insisted on the keyboard including a numeric keyboard. So how could you make that kind of a thing cuddly? Anyway, this is a concept for what that might have looked like before they blew the introduction of their computer and had to lay everybody, including me, off. So this product never saw the light of day. So that was the end of my Apple IIc presentation. I thought I would open it up to questions. I'm happy to answer any questions anybody has.
Okay, let's see, Rob. Here's a question from Kent. He says, how did the back and forth with the board slash electrical design work with the case design? How did you know what size to aim for?
So there was, it was a trial and error process. So initially, well, the original concept for the 2C came from Steve taking the PC board out of an Apple IIe and putting it down on a conference table, and then grabbing a disk drive internally, a flatter one, throwing that on top, throwing a power supply on top, and then grabbing a keyboard and putting it on top. And he said, that's what the next product should be. It should be no bigger than those components. And if you can shrink the size of those, great, do that. But the PC board should be no wider than the keyboard. So the electrical engineers, I was looking at them and they were shaking their heads. How are we going to do this? So connectors took up almost the entire width of that back panel, except for where the power supply was. And we kept having to find new connectors that were a bit narrower, so we could get them all squeezed in there. But I don't remember how many generations of PC board layouts we went through before we got it all to fit. So good question, Kent.
Next question is, when you were talking about the unprintable code name, your audio kind of dropped out at that moment, which I swear we weren't trying to actually obscure it, but we're wondering what was the unprintable code name and what was the acronym for it.
So this came from Mike Markula, who was the world's biggest, most wonderful gentleman, kind and kind-hearted, and I had never heard him swear before. So I was shocked when he came out with elegant little fucker.
All right.
Yes, so that
see.
became the acronym ELF.
Cool. So let's see. Jeff is asking, he says, I heard rumors for how Apple used their Cray for design, both electrical and industrial. And was it around for the Apple IIc development?
No, that was much later. I forget what year that showed up in, but Apple got that, and a lot of people, they just didn't know what to do with it. So it was underutilized for, I think, the first several years.
Cool. And then let's see, Brian is asking, were you involved in the development of the Apple IIc Plus?
No, I was gone at that point, and I think the guy who replaced me, his name was Gavin Ivester, and another guy was brought in too named Adam Grosser. Adam now is a very successful VC and is working a lot in the AI and airborne EV space. And Gavin Ivester, until last year, he was the head of industrial design for Bang & Olufsen in Copenhagen.
Cool. Very cool. All right. Let's see. I have a question, if I can indulge myself. And this is maybe a question both for you, Rob, and perhaps for Rich Williams, who's also here in the audience. Everybody says Apple II forever, and that was kind of the theme for that event in 1984. And I'm wondering, at the time, was there any feeling that it truly was going to last forever, or was it perhaps like a subtle sense of impending doom or an undercurrent? And I know that's a very tricky question, but I'm just wondering, like, if you can think back to that period, what was your feeling about that?
Well, well, I can tell you, it depended on which Steve you were talking to. So Woz, of course, thought it was Apple II forever. Jobs, of course, thought that Macintosh was going to sweep the world and dominate the world of computing. So I was kind of straddling. I got a lot of teasing because I was the first guy, first person in the Apple II division to order a Macintosh for my desk. It was a little controversial.
I think Rich Williams is going to chime in for a second.
Great.
Hi, Rob. This is Rich Williams from the 2C Software Group, and I enjoyed your presentation immensely. On answering the question, if you go back to 1984, you have to keep in mind, nobody really knew was the Macintosh going to take off. So we certainly knew at least Apple II was forever as long as we were paying the bills.
That makes sense. All right, great, thank you. Let's see, what other questions do we have? Okay, here's another question. Actually, this is from Rich.
Great.
He's wondering at what point in the design of the Apple IIc was the decision made to use the external power brick, and how did that affect the design choices?
I think that was made early on because it was pretty clear, we weren't going to be able to develop, the C computer, which was intended to be cuddly and compact if that was internal. So I don't remember exactly when, but I remember thinking, being so relieved when we could remove that brick from the inside.
Was there actually like a struggle to try to fit it in? I mean, was that like you guys really, really wanted to, and then you just realized after a couple months that it just was not going to happen?
I don't remember an awful lot of debate. I remember a lot of angst about having the brick. We knew people were not going to love that. But the trade-off we felt was worth it, and being able to have a much lower profile computer that, you could use on your lap.
Okay, gotcha. So let's see, here's a question. It says, what was the intended way to use the metal monitor stand? Was the intention to have the Apple IIc always in the stand, or just when the computer was not in use?
So it was designed so that you could use it either way. But after we realized what needed, the way the two worked together, we had ideas for how we could improve it in the next generation, but of course that never happened. But one of the ideas was, to have the handle when it was folded down, kind of lock into place in the monitor stand, so that if you didn't want it kind of sliding around, that type of thing, it felt like a more cohesive unit.
Cool. Okay. And then here's a question from Jeff related to the earlier question. Was there a battery option part of the original design?
Yes, I designed a battery pack. If you put the handle up, the battery pack would fit right underneath the back 1/3 of the 2C and fit exactly perfectly underneath it. Now, it didn't mechanically attach, although we did explore ways we could do that. In the end, we kind of said, "Now we'll just have people rest the computer on top of it." And then we did have some rubber things that fit into the vent slot so it wouldn't slide around, that type of thing. But I don't think it ever got put into production. I still have the drawings for it.
Cool. Okay, here's a question from Steve. He's asking, He says the Apple II, IIe, and even the Apple III had the reset key on the right side of the keyboard. What got the reset key to be on the left for the Apple IIc, and was there any large debate over that?
I'm sure there was a big debate over it. I because there was over everything that was a little bit different. I honestly don't remember how that came to be.
Okay. And here's another question from Brian. He says your Amiga design is very beautiful, and I guess it's more of a comment. And then he's asking if you have a website or any or a book sharing your stories and history.
Oh, well, there are a few books. The best book is titled Apple Design, and it came out in 1997 or 98. It was published by a design magazine called Graphice. It's spelled just like graphic, but with an S at the end. And it was beautifully produced, and it has all of the Apple industrial design stuff from 1977 through, I guess, the mid 90s. So, yeah, it goes all the way up to the Newton. I think the Newton might be one of the last products in it.
Cool.
So there's a huge section on frog design and the Apple IIc development and all of that.
Excellent. All right. Let's see. Questions. Yeah. Oh, here. Okay. Here's a question from Ron. I'm not sure what he's actually asking here. He says the LCD question mark why?
Yeah, well, that was debated too, of course. It was because nobody else was really doing something like that, and it was a quest to make the Apple II, be perceived as a forever product and more competitive against Macintosh and other things that were coming out in the market at the time.
Okay.
Yeah, I think functionally, it wasn't as good an idea as it was conceptually and from a marketing perspective.
Well, I guess for what it's worth, those things are go for huge bucks on eBay now. So they're definitely collector's items.
Oh, is that right? Oh, I still have one.
Oh, there you go. If you ever need some extra cash.
Wow.
Okay, so yeah, let's see. We have one question from the audience. Let's see. I'm going to attempt to pass the microphone over there, and we'll hope that works.
Okay.
Was there any consideration given to the design and use in schools, such as kids banging on it, the slamming of the drive and the discs, and unplugging the cables and stuff like that? How was the 2C going to be sold and used in schools from a design perspective?
Yeah, there were two reasons it wasn't seriously considered as something that should be marketed to education. One was that Apple was, at that point, the Apple IIe was hugely profitable for Apple, and a lot of the schools really liked the expansion ports and stuff, and the greater versatility of what they could do with it. And some of the educators liked the fact that it took up a more substantial footprint, and so they had to worry less about students knocking it off desks and that type of thing. The other reason was that the 2C, when it was launched, was I think $14.95 or so or maybe it was more. I kind of forget the final price, but it was going to be a lower profit computer, and so Apple was aggressively pricing it to go after market share in the home computer market.
How close was the feedback between the design and engineering? Yeah. like that feedback loop? How was it, tight or loose or what?
Uh, well, I guess I would describe it as tight. So when you did a when we did a design that Steve Jobs had blessed, it was pretty much carved in stone unless there was something that was a huge showstopper that nobody could prevent. So there wasn't, once we'd finished on the overall, design of the skin, so to speak, then it was up to engineering and manufacturing to figure out how to make it work and fit. So I tried to work with the electrical engineers, but at a certain point, Steve said, "Okay, I'm freezing it. They have to figure out how to make it work. Rob, you're not to make any more changes."
Okay, thanks. I have a question. So I think I might have missed this, or maybe I just don't know the history that well. But with the Snow White design, so the name Snow White and just that whole design concept, it sounded like that actually really did not come out of Frog Design. It was more of an internal thing that then Frog Design sort of adopted with you working with them. Is that the way that played out?
Well, so here's how that happened. So I proposed to Steve that, we create a project and we design hypothetical products for each division that would represent the next generation. So we could move beyond the HP look and feel that Apple's original products had. Steve thought that was going to be a political clusterfuck, the way he put it internally. So then I said, so what if we bring in some outside designers, and then then they're independent and they don't have any political standing internally. And he liked that idea a lot. And so Jerry Manick was the one, though, who came up with the name Snow White and wrote up the document. He pretty much wrote up the design brief by himself, and then Jerry and I and Terry Oyama, we went to Europe and interviewed these different designers, and Hartmut Esslinger was one of them. And then after we brought Hartmut to Cupertino and introduced them to Steve with the other designers, and they did the bake-off, then Hartmut changed the name of Esslinger Design to Frog Design. So
Got it.
That was the chronology.
All right. That makes perfect sense. Thank you.
Certainly.
Let's see. What other questions do we have? Anything else here? Okay. Well, Rob, I think that's it here. And, we just all want to thank you again for, spending all this time with us and sharing all those very cool documents. And if you, if you ever get the chance to come to KansasFest one of these years, we'd love to see you in person. But anyway, thanks again.
Hey, it was my pleasure. I really enjoyed it and had a ton of fun doing this. So thank you, and apologies for the technical problems, but everything else was great.